The night shift was drawing to a close, and Officer Chen was looking forward to heading home after what had been a relatively quiet evening. The digital clock on her patrol car's dashboard read 4:47 a.m., and the streets of Pine Valley were peaceful under the glow of streetlights. She just finished her last cup of coffee from the local diner, where the overnight staff knew every officer by name. The radio crackled to life, breaking the comfortable silence. Unit 247, we've got multiple reports of strange noises coming from the old Riverside Industrial Complex, Building 7. Callers describing sounds like crying or whimpering. Any units in the area, please respond. Officer Chen sat up straighter, her tired muscles suddenly alert. She knew that warehouse well. It had been abandoned for nearly 3 years after the manufacturing company moved overseas. Recently, it had become a source of concern for the community, with teenagers occasionally using it as a hangout spot despite the no trespassing signs. Dispatch, this is Unit 247. I'm about 5 minutes out. I'll check it out, she responded, already making a U-turn at the next intersection. Something about this call felt different from the usual noise complaints. In her 8 years on the force, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her this wasn't just some teenagers having a late-night adventure. As she drove, her mind cycled through the possibilities. Could be homeless individuals seeking shelter. They'd seen an increase lately with the closing of the downtown shelter for renovations. Or maybe it was animals. Last month, they'd found a family of raccoons that had the whole neighborhood convinced there was a burglar on the loose. The streets were empty at this hour, save for a few early morning delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. The industrial district loomed ahead, a maze of concrete and metal sleeping under the fading stars. Officer Chen flipped through her mental file of recent reports from the area. A couple of break-ins at the packaging plant 2 blocks over, some vandalism at the old paper mill, but nothing from Building 7. She switched off her headlights as she turned onto Industrial Way, letting the patrol car roll quietly past the abandoned buildings. The warehouse district had its own kind of silence at this hour, not the peaceful quiet of residential areas, but a hollow emptiness that made every sound seem more significant. The call had mentioned crying or whimpering. Officer Chen had responded to similar calls throughout her career, and they often turned out to be cats or dogs. But there had been something in the dispatcher's voice, a subtle tension that suggested this might be different. 3 separate callers had reported the sounds within the last hour, all describing them similarly, all expressing genuine concern. Her radio buzzed again. Unit 247, be advised. Caller from the security company mentions their cameras picked up movement near the east entrance about 20 minutes ago. No clear visual due to poor lighting. Copy that, dispatch, she responded, making a mental note to approach from the west side. This would give her a better view of the entire building, while keeping her presence unknown to whoever or whatever was inside. The first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky, creating long shadows between the buildings. Officer Chen parked her patrol car a block away, deciding a stealthy approach on foot would be better. As she stepped out of her vehicle, the cool morning air carried a mix of scents: damp concrete, distant factory smoke, and something else, something that made her pause. She did a quick equipment check: flashlight, radio, body camera on. Her hand brushed against the familiar grip of her service weapon, not drawing it but reassuring herself of its presence. Standard procedure would be to wait for backup on a call like this, but if someone was in trouble, minutes could make a difference. The gravel crunched softly under her boots as she approached Building 7. The warehouse stood like a sleeping giant, its weathered brick walls stretching up into the pre-dawn gloom. Most of the windows were intact on this side, though a few were boarded up with plywood that had seen better days. An old sign still clung to the wall: Riverside Manufacturing, quality since 1976. That's when she heard it, the sound that would mark the beginning of one of the most memorable calls of her career. It was faint, barely audible over the distant hum of the city, but unmistakably there. A sound that made her throat tighten and her pulse quicken, because this wasn't the mischievous laughter of teenagers or the scavenging of wildlife. This was something else entirely, something that would lead her to a discovery that would change multiple lives forever. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange as Officer Chen approached Building 7. The massive warehouse stood before her like a sleeping giant, its weathered brick walls telling stories of busier days. She remembered when this place had been full of life, humming with machinery and workers' voices. Now, it was just another hollow reminder of how quickly things could change. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying that special kind of stillness that exists only in these early hours when the world seems to hold its breath between night and day. Each step she took echoed slightly in the empty parking lot, despite her attempts to move quietly. Broken glass crunched beneath her boots, and old papers skittered across the cracked pavement in the gentle morning breeze. Her training kicked in automatically as she scanned the area. The warehouse's windows, most of them broken or boarded up, looked like tired eyes staring down at her patrol car. Nature had started to reclaim parts of the building. Ivy crept up the walls, and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. But something was different today. There were fresh tire tracks in the gravel near the loading dock, probably no more than a few hours old. That's when she heard it again, the sound that had brought her here. A rhythmic tapping, like someone trying to send a message. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from somewhere inside the building, echoing off the empty walls in a way that made it hard to pinpoint the exact location. The sound was clearer now, definitely not an animal or the wind playing tricks. Officer Chen reached for her radio, keeping her voice low. Dispatch, Unit 247 on scene at Building 7. I've got audible sounds from inside, requesting backup to assist in building sweep. The response came back quickly. Copy that, Unit 247. Unit 183 is en route, ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She weighed her options carefully. Standard procedure would be to wait for backup, but something about that tapping sound made her stomach knot with urgency. It seemed deliberate, almost desperate. If someone was in trouble, 8 minutes could feel like an eternity. Moving closer to the building, she noticed other details that raised red flags. Fresh scratches around one of the side doors. A candy wrapper that couldn't have been there long. The bright colors hadn't yet faded in the sun. And footprints in the dust, lots of them, leading to and from that same door. The warehouse's shadow stretched across the parking lot like a long dark finger pointing her way. As she approached the side entrance, she could smell the musty odor of abandoned spaces, damp concrete, old wood, and something else she couldn't quite identify. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a thin slice of early morning light cut through the darkness inside. Her flashlight beam caught something metallic near the door. A small keychain with a worn plastic cartoon character hanging from it. The kind a kid would have. Her heart rate picked up a notch. This wasn't looking like a routine call anymore. The tapping had stopped, replaced by what sounded like movement deeper inside the building. Shuffling noises, then a muffled sound that could have been a cough. Officer Chen pulled out her flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the gloom. The light revealed a corridor lined with old shelving units, their metal frames casting strange shadows on the walls. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling her that someone needed help. She took a deep breath, tasting the dusty air. The morning light was growing stronger, filtering through the broken windows high above, creating patches of light and shadow that danced across the floor. A sudden noise made her freeze, the distinct sound of something being knocked over, followed by what she was now certain was a human voice. It was too muffled to make out words, but the tone was clear. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet. She checked her watch. 5 more minutes until backup would arrive. The responsible thing would be to wait, to secure the perimeter and ensure a safe approach. But there was something about this situation that felt different from the usual calls, something that told her time might be of the essence. Moving carefully, she stepped through the doorway, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast space. The beam of her flashlight revealed more fresh footprints in the dust, creating a clear trail deeper into the building. These weren't the random patterns of teenagers looking for a place to hang out. They were purposeful, leading somewhere specific. The air inside was cooler than outside and carried traces of something that made her pause, not just the usual abandoned building smell, but something that triggered memories of her own childhood. Something that made this feel less like a criminal investigation and more like something else entirely. As she followed the trail of footprints, the warehouse seemed to come alive with small sounds, the settling of old metal in the warmy morning air, the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness, and always that faint human presence she could sense but not yet see. Each step took her closer to what she somehow knew would be one of those discoveries that would stick with her for the rest of her career. The flashlight beam caught something ahead, a reflection that shouldn't have been there. Something that would lead her to understand why those 3 separate callers had been so concerned about the sounds they'd heard. Something that would remind her why she'd chosen this job in the first place and why sometimes following your instincts was more important than following procedure. Following years of police training and experience, Officer Chen pressed her back against the cool brick wall and radioed her position. Unit 247, conducting sweep of East Corridor, Building 7. The static-filled response from dispatch reminded her that backup was still 3 minutes out. Every passing second felt heavy with possibility. The morning light was growing stronger now, sneaking through the broken windows high above and casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Her flashlight beam caught something that made her pause, fresh footprints in the thick dust, but these were different from what she'd seen at the entrance. These were smaller, like those of a child. Her heart began to beat faster. In 8 years on the force, she'd seen all kinds of situations in abandoned buildings. Homeless people seeking shelter, teenagers looking for thrills, even drug deals gone wrong. But child-sized footprints, that changed everything. The prints told the story if you knew how to read them. They weren't just random wandering. They showed purpose, regular trips back and forth along the same path. Some were fresh, others older, suggesting whoever made them had been coming here for days, maybe weeks. Beside them were other marks, like something had been dragged repeatedly along the same route. A soft sound echoed through the warehouse, something between a whimper and a whisper. Officer Chen adjusted her grip on the flashlight, careful to keep the beam low. The sound had come from behind a pile of old wooden pallets stacked against the far wall. As she got closer, she could make out more details. There were signs of habitation, empty water bottles, food wrappers carefully tucked into a plastic bag, and what looked like a one blanket poking out from behind the pallets. "Police officer," she called out, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "Is someone there? You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay." The words echoed off the high ceiling, bouncing back like ghostly whispers. For a moment, complete silence. Then, a shuffling sound, followed by what was definitely a sniffle. Officer Chen took a careful step forward, moving her flashlight beam slowly so as not to startle whoever was hiding. That's when she spotted the backpack, small, blue, with cartoon characters on it. The kind you'd see in any elementary school hallway. It was propped against the wall, partially unzipped, a few school papers spilling out. The air felt different in this part of the warehouse. Amid the usual musty smell of abandonment, there was something else, the faint scent of peanut butter and jelly, hand sanitizer, and that unmistakable smell of wet dog. Dog? Her flashlight beam swung to the left, catching a glimpse of what looked like an old mattress dragged into the corner. "Hello." She tried again, softer this time. "My name is Officer Chen. I'm here to help." Another shuffle, and then a small voice, thick with tears. Is it really just you?" The voice came from behind the mattress, tucked into the corner where the walls met. Officer Chen's training kicked in automatically. She did a quick scan of the area, noting possible exits, potential weapons, anything that could pose a threat. But her instincts were telling her this wasn't a dangerous situation, at least not in the way she'd been trained to handle. She moved the flashlight beam away from the corner, letting it rest on the floor nearby. "Yes, it's just me right now. Though I should tell you my partner will be here soon. We got calls about sounds coming from the building." People were worried. A pause, then some movement. His small face peeked out from behind the mattress. A boy, couldn't be more than 12, his face streaked with dirt and dry tears. But what caught Officer Chen's attention was his expression. Not fear of being caught, but something deeper, more painful. the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for their young shoulders. "I didn't mean to scare anyone," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to be quiet, I really did. But Max, he's having a hard time today." As if on cue, a weak whimper came from behind the mattress. Officer Chen's flashlight revealed what the boy was trying to protect. There, curled up on a pile of old blankets, was an elderly dog. The animal's gray muzzle and cloudy eyes spoke of many years of life, but it was the labored breathing that made Officer Chen's chest tighten. She'd seen enough in her years of service to recognize when an animal was nearing the end of its journey. The boy's hand rested protectively on the dog's head, fingers gently stroking the gray fur. "His name is Max," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "He's been my best friend since I was a baby." And now, he couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The whole scene told the story: the carefully arranged blankets, the half-empty water bowl, the photos taped to the wall showing happier days of a boy and his dog playing in the sun. Officer Chen realized this wasn't just a case of a runaway or a kid looking for adventure. This was something far more complex and heartbreaking. This was a child trying to protect the one thing he couldn't bear to lose, hiding away in this dusty corner of the world because facing reality was too painful. Her radio crackled. Backup was 1 minute out. She needed to handle this next moment carefully. One wrong word could shatter the fragile trust beginning to form. She holstered her flashlight, letting the growing morning light from the windows illuminate the scene. Sometimes the best thing a police officer can do is remember that behind every call, every situation, there's a human story waiting to be understood. As morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the warehouse, the full reality of the scene before Officer Chen began to sink in. The makeshift living space told a story of careful planning and deep love. A worn mattress had been deliberately positioned in the corner where two walls met, creating a sense of security. Around it, someone had arranged blankets and pillows with obvious care, forming a nest-like space that spoke of protection and comfort. The boy, who quietly introduced himself as Andy, hadn't just stumbled upon this place. Empty food containers were neatly stacked in a cardboard box, evidence of meals shared between a child and his faithful companion. A small backpack rested nearby, unzipped to reveal schoolbooks and what looked like a hastily packed change of clothes. On the wall, held up by peeling tape, were photos that made Officer Chen's heart ache. A younger Andy playing fetch with a more energetic Max, the two of them curled up reading together, a Christmas morning scene with Max wearing a Santa hat. Max, the elderly dog lying on the carefully arranged blankets, was clearly struggling. His breathing was labored, each intake of air seeming to require more effort than the last. Despite his obvious discomfort, his tail still managed a weak thump against the mattress when Andy stroked his head. The dog's eyes, though clouded with age, never left his young owner's face. 3 days ago, Andy began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom and Dad said it was time. That Max was suffering and we needed to." He couldn't finish the sentence, his hands clutching at Max's fur. The dog responded by trying to lift his head, wanting to comfort his human even now. "But I couldn't let them. Max has always been there for me. Always. When I was scared of the dark, when I broke my arm last year, when I had no friends at the new school, Max was there." Officer Chen noticed more details as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. A water bowl, carefully positioned within Max's reach. A small battery-powered fan, probably brought to help with the warehouse's stuffy air. Dog treats arranged in a line, most untouched. A worn tennis ball that had clearly seen years of play. Each item represented a child's desperate attempt to create comfort in an impossible situation. "I've been planning this for weeks," Andy continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "I found this place when we walked by during Max's shorter walks. He can't go far anymore, you know. I started bringing supplies little by little. I thought if I could just get him away from there, maybe," his voice cracked, and he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Maybe time would just stop and I wouldn't have to." Max let out a whimper, and Andy immediately shifted his attention back to the dog. The bond between them was palpable, a connection forged through years of unconditional love and shared experiences. Officer Chen watched as Andy reached for a small bag, pulling out one of Max's favorite treats. The dog's nose twitched with interest, but he couldn't muster the energy to take it. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse, backup arriving as promised. But Officer Chen held up a hand, signaling them to wait. This moment needed delicate handling. She could see in Andy's eyes the same pain she felt at 13 when facing the loss of her own childhood pet, a mix of desperate hope and dawning understanding that love sometimes means making the hardest choices. "Your parents must be really worried," she said gently, settling down on the floor near them. Max's tail thumped again, a brave attempt at greeting. "They reported you missing right away. They've been searching everywhere." "I left a note," Andy said, guilt creeping into his voice. "I said we were safe. I couldn't watch them take him away. Max hates the vet. He gets so scared. I wanted him to be somewhere he felt safe. With me." Officer Chen noticed how Max struggled to keep his head up, how each breath seemed more difficult than the last. The dog was holding on, but she could see it was taking all his remaining strength to do so. And somehow, looking at Andy's face, she could tell he saw it too. Behind the denial and fear, understanding was slowly dawning. "Andy," she said softly, "can I tell you something about Max? Something I've learned from watching you two in just these few minutes." She waited for his nod before continuing. "Max is still taking care of you even now. Even though he's tired and in pain, he's trying to stay strong because he can see how much you're hurting. That's what best friends do. They protect each other no matter what." A sob escaped Andy's throat, and Max immediately tried to lift his head higher, wanting to comfort his boy even as his own strength faded. This simple action seemed to break through something in Andy's heart. The tears he'd been fighting back began to fall freely. "I don't want him to hurt anymore," Andy whispered. The words seemingly surprised him as they came out. "But I don't want him to go." Officer Chen reached for her radio, knowing it was time to make some calls to Andy's parents, to a nearby veterinary clinic she knew well, to the people who could help make this impossible moment a little more bearable. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is acknowledge when love means letting go. Officer Chen knew the next few moments would be crucial. In her years on the force, she'd learned that building trust wasn't about the words you chose, it was about the space you created for others to feel heard. She settled down on the dusty floor, maintaining enough distance to let Andy feel in control while staying close enough to show she cared. The morning light had grown stronger, streaming through the high warehouse windows in dusty beams that illuminated the scene in gentle stripes. Andy sat cross-legged beside Max, one hand never leaving his dog's fur. The elderly dog's breathing had developed a rhythmic pattern, labored but steady, each breath a determined effort. "You know," Officer Chen began softly, "I can see you've taken really good care of this space." She gestured to the organized supplies, the careful arrangement of Max's bed, the way everything had its place. "How long have you been preparing this?" Andy's fingers continued their gentle stroking of Max's fur as he answered. "About 3 weeks," he admitted. "After the last vet visit. When they said," his voice caught, but he pushed through. "When they said Max didn't have much time left. I started bringing stuff here little by little. Nobody noticed because I said I was going to the library to study." Officer Chen nodded, noting how the boy had thought through every detail. The location wasn't randomly chosen. It was close enough to home to reach easily, but far enough to feel safe. The supplies were carefully selected: blankets for comfort, water bottles for both of them, even a small battery-powered radio that sat silent in the corner. "That must have taken a lot of planning," she said. "You really thought about everything Max would need." She watched as Andy's shoulders relaxed slightly at the acknowledgement. He wasn't being treated like a troublemaker. He was being seen for what he was, a child trying his best to protect someone he loved. "I've been coming here with him for short visits," Andy continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared his story. "Just to get him used to it. He was scared at first, but then he started to like it. It became our special place." He reached for a worn notebook nearby, its pages filled with detailed notes. "I wrote down everything he needed. His medicine times, his favorite treats when he usually needs to go out." Officer Chen's heart tightened as she looked at the careful handwriting, the love evident in every detailed instruction. This wasn't an impulsive running away. This was a child creating a sanctuary, trying to hold back time itself through sheer force of will and preparation. Max shifted slightly, letting out a small whimper, and Andy immediately adjusted the blanket around him. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his voice taking on a gentleness that spoke of years of such exchanges. "You're okay. We're together. How long have you and Max been friends?" Officer Chen asked, though she could guess from the dog's age. The question brought the first hint of a smile to Andy's face. "Mom says he was already waiting by my crib the day they'd brought me home from the hospital," he said. "He used to sleep under my crib every night. When I started walking, he would walk beside me, letting me hold onto his fur for balance. Mom has videos of it." As Andy spoke, Officer Chen noticed how Max's tail would thump weakly against the mattress at the sound of his voice, even though the dog's eyes were now closed. The bond between them was tangible, a connection built through countless small moments of love and trust. "Last year," Andy continued, "when we moved here and I didn't know anyone at the new school, Max would wait by the window every day. The minute I walked in, no matter how bad the day was, he would bring me his favorite toy. Like he knew I needed it." His voice cracked slightly. "He's always known what I needed." Officer Chen saw her opening. "He's still trying to take care of you, isn't he? Even now, when he's tired and hurting, he's trying to make you feel better." She watched as Andy's hands stilled in Max's fur, realization flickering across his face. "That's what makes him special," she continued gently. "Some dogs are just like that. They put their humans first, right until the end. My childhood dog was the same way." This caught Andy's attention, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. "You had a dog too?" he asked, curiosity momentarily overcoming his grief. "I did," she nodded, letting her own memories surface. "His name was Buddy. He was my best friend through elementary school and middle school. And just like Max, he was there for every important moment, every sad day, every happy day." Andy leaned forward slightly, recognition in his eyes. What happened to him?" Officer Chen took a careful breath, choosing her words with care. "We had to make a very hard decision, just like your parents are trying to do. Buddy was in pain, but he was trying so hard to hide it because he didn't want to worry me. In the end, loving him meant being brave enough to put his needs before my own fears." She watched as Andy processed this, his hand never stopping its gentle movement through Max's fur. The dog's breathing had grown more labored, but still he pressed his head against Andy's leg, offering comfort even now. "Does it?" Andy's voice was barely a whisper. "Does it ever stop hurting?" "The hurt changes," Officer Chen answered honestly. "It becomes something different, more like gratitude for all the love they gave us. I still smile every time I see a dog that looks like Buddy, or when I remember our adventures together. Those memories become a gift instead of just pain." As if understanding the gravity of the conversation, Max lifted his head slightly, managing to lick Andy's hand once before settling back down. The gesture seemed to break something open in Andy's heart, and tears began rolling down his cheeks. The warehouse had grown quieter now, the early morning bustle of the industrial district muffled by the thick walls. Officer Chen had radioed for her backup to maintain a perimeter, giving her time and space to handle this delicate situation. The sun had risen higher, its warm light now streaming through the dusty windows, creating a gentle glow around Andy and Max. "You know what I remember most about my dog Buddy?" Officer Chen said softly, watching as Andy wiped his tears with his sleeve. "It's not the day we had to say goodbye. It's all the amazing days before that. Like the time he tried to catch a butterfly and ended up running in circles until he got dizzy and fell over." This drew a small wet laugh from Andy. "Max did something like that with Bubbles once," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He kept trying to bite them, but every time they popped, he looked so confused, he just couldn't figure out where they went." Max's tail thumped weakly at the sound of Andy's laugh, even though his breathing remained labored. The old dog was still trying to participate in the moment, still trying to be part of his boy's happiness despite his obvious discomfort. "Can I show you something?" Andy asked suddenly, reaching for his backpack. He pulled out a worn photo album, its corners softened with age and use. "I brought this because I was scared I might forget things." Officer Chen moved closer, sitting cross-legged on the floor as Andy opened the album. The first photo showed a tiny baby sleeping peacefully with a younger Max curled protectively around the crib. "Mom took this the first week I came home," Andy explained. "She said Max wouldn't leave my side, not even to eat. They had to bring his food bowl to the nursery." Page after page told the story of a boy and his dog growing up together. Max teaching baby Andy to walk, holding steady as tiny hands gripped his fur. Max dressed as a superhero for Halloween, matching Andy's costume. Max sitting patiently while a toddler Andy read him a story, the book held upside down. "Here's from last summer," Andy said, his finger tracing a photo of Max lying in a sunny spot in their backyard. That's when he first started slowing down. He couldn't play fetch as long anymore, but he would still try because he knew I loved it. His voice caught. He's always tried to make me happy, even when things were hard for him. Officer Chen noticed how Andy's voice changed when he reached the more recent photos, recognition creeping in around the edges of his denial. The images themselves told the story, Max growing grayer, moving more carefully, but his eyes always fixed lovingly on Andy. "The vet explained it to us last month," Andy continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "She said Max has something wrong with his heart, and there's fluid in his lungs, and his back legs are getting worse, and..." He took a shuddering breath. "She said he's in pain all the time now, even with the medicine, but he still wags his tail when he sees me. He still tries to play. How can I just..." Max whimpered softly, trying to lift his head toward Andy's distress. The effort seemed to exhaust him, and his breathing became more labored. Andy immediately shifted his attention back to his friend, gently stroking the gray muzzle until Max's breathing steadied slightly. "You know what I think?" Officer Chen said gently, watching the interaction. "I think Max has spent his whole life teaching you about love. In these photos, I can see him teaching baby you how to walk, teaching little you how to be brave on the first day of school, teaching older you about loyalty and friendship." She paused, making sure Andy was following her words. "And now, even though it's the hardest lesson of all, he's teaching you something else. He's teaching you that sometimes loving someone means being strong enough to put their needs before our own wishes." Andy's hands trembled as he turned to the last page of the album. The final photo showed Max sleeping in a sunbeam, peaceful despite his age and illness. "Mom took this last week," he whispered. "Before they told me about the appointment, I got so angry. I yelled at them. I said they didn't love him like I did. But what?" Officer Chen prompted softly, seeing understanding beginning to dawn in Andy's eyes. "But maybe they were trying to be brave for both of us. For all of us." Andy's voice was barely audible. "Max has always been the brave one. Maybe now it's my turn to be brave for him." Officer Chen felt the weight of this moment, watching as Andy gently closed the photo album and turned his full attention back to Max. The old dog's eyes opened slightly, and despite his obvious exhaustion, he managed to lift his head just enough to lick Andy's hand once. "I don't want him to hurt anymore," Andy said, the words seeming to surprise even him. "I always thought being brave meant fighting to keep him with me. But maybe," his voice broke, and fresh tears fell onto Max's fur. "Maybe being brave means something different this time." The morning light had filled the warehouse now, turning the dusty air into a gentle golden haze. In this light, Officer Chen could see both the child Andy was and the person he was becoming in this moment, someone learning one of life's hardest lessons about love and sacrifice. The morning had fully bloomed by the time Officer Chen made the necessary calls. The warehouse, once cold and abandoned, had become a space of transformation, not just for Andy and Max, but for everyone involved. When Andy's parents arrived, there were no angry words, no accusations. They simply rushed to their son, understanding written across their faces as they took in the careful preparation of the makeshift shelter. Andy's mother knelt beside the mattress, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to touch both her son and the dog who had helped raise him. "Oh, honey," she whispered, seeing the notebook full of careful instructions, the organized supplies, the photos on the wall. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" His father stood for a moment, taking in the scene, the water bowl positioned just right, the fan angled perfectly, the blankets arranged with such care. Then he too knelt down, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "We've been so worried," he said softly. "But I understand now. You were trying to protect him, just like he's always protected you." The emergency veterinarian arrived shortly after, a kind-faced woman who took in the situation with gentle understanding. She knelt down beside Max, her examination careful and respectful. He's held on so strong, she said quietly, looking at Andy. But he's very tired now. You can see it in his eyes. He's been staying brave for you. Andy nodded, his hand never leaving Max's fur. I know, he whispered. I can feel it. He's still trying to take care of me, isn't he? Even now. The vet smiled softly. That's what the best dogs do. They love us until their very last moment. And Max here, he's clearly one of the very best. Officer Chen watched as Andy took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders slightly. Ken, he paused, gathering courage. Can we make it nice for him? Not scary like a vet office. He always gets scared there. The vet nodded, understanding immediately. Of course we can. This can be wherever Max feels safest. Where would you like him to be? Andy looked around at the space he'd created, then at his parents. Could we take him home? To the backyard? There's this spot under the old oak tree where he always likes to lie in the sun. It's his favorite place in the whole world. His parents exchanged a look of pride through their tears, seeing their son's growth in this moment. Of course we can, sweetheart, his mother said. That's a beautiful idea. What happened next was a testament to the gentle strength of everyone involved. Andy's father carefully lifted Max, wrapped in his favorite blanket, while Andy gathered the photos from the wall, and his mother collected the supplies he'd so carefully arranged. Officer Chen helped carry some of the items to their car, watching as this family came together in their grief and love. At home, in that sun-dappled spot under the oak tree, they created a moment of peace. Max lay on his blanket, surrounded by the people who loved him, in the place where he'd spent so many happy hours. The vet explained everything gently, making sure Andy understood what would happen. He won't hurt anymore? Andy asked, his voice small but steady. No more pain, the vet assured him. Just peaceful sleep like drifting off in the sunshine. Andy lay down beside his friend, their faces close together. Thank you for teaching me about being brave, he whispered to Max. And for all the walks and games, and for waiting for me after school, and his voice caught, but he continued, and for loving me so much. I love you too, buddy. It's okay to rest now. Max, as if understanding, gave one last gentle lick to Andy's cheek. His tail thumped weakly against the grass, one final show of love, as he drifted peacefully away, surrounded by the family he'd helped raise and protect. The weeks that followed were full of both grief and healing. Officer Chen kept in touch with the family, and she wasn't surprised when, 2 months later, Andy asked to speak at her department's community outreach program. Standing before a group of other children who had lost beloved pets, he shared his story, not just of loss, but of love and growth. That speech became the foundation for something bigger. With support from the police department and local veterinarians, Andy helped create a support group for children dealing with pet loss. They called it Max's Memory Makers, and they met in the community center every Saturday. Children would bring photos of their pets, share stories, and learn that grief was a natural part of having loved so deeply. Officer Chen would often stop by these meetings, watching as Andy helped other children understand what he had learned in that warehouse, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go with love. On the wall of their meeting room hung a beautiful photo of Max, his gray muzzle lifted in a happy smile, sunlight catching his fur. Below it were the words Andy had chosen. Every great dog teaches us how to love. The greatest ones teach us how to be brave. The warehouse where it all began didn't stay abandoned for long. The city converted it into an animal shelter with Andy as one of its youngest volunteers. And in a quiet corner of that busy, happy space, a small plaque tells the story of a boy and his dog, reminding everyone who reads it that true love sometimes means finding the courage to put someone else's peace before our own wishes.